everyone, it's Agnieszka from 5 Minute Language. Welcome to my channel. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already and give this video a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. So I know that a lot of people who subscribe to my channel are actually interested in both Polish and Russian. I've got a video about how to pronounce Polish names, which is probably one of the most popular videos on my channel. So I thought I would make something similar today, and I would actually talk about the differences and similarities between Polish and Russian. So many people who don't know the two languages assume that those two languages are very similar to each other, and that a Polish person would automatically be able to understand a Russian speaker. But actually, personally, I am Polish and I don't understand Russian. I don't understand when Russian people speak Russian. I can probably understand some individual words, but if somebody spoke to me in Russian, I wouldn't be able to have a conversation in Polish with them and make it work. Some Polish people understand more Russian than me. Maybe they're more kind of talented and they can understand it, or maybe they did a little bit at school. If you're a Polish person and you can understand Russian without ever having learnt it, let me know in the comments. Or if you're Russian, let me know if you can understand Polish. So basically, both Polish and Russian are Slavic languages. They belong to slightly different groups within that Slavic languages group, but they are essentially both Slavic languages. They share a lot in terms of grammar, and that's probably the biggest similarity between the two languages. They both use cases, for example. So when you're learning Polish or Russian, you will have to learn different kind of variants of the same word depending on the function that word has in a sentence. So in English, when you say, I have a dog and I couldn't find my dog, the word dog doesn't change, it's always the same. Whereas in Polish and in Russian, that word would change, it would take on an ending, and its form would change slightly because the function is different. So that's essentially what cases are about. Both languages use them. If you're learning Polish and Russian, you just learn the concept once and basically you can understand it in both languages. The grammar is very similar in terms of syntax, tenses. Tenses are slightly easier in Russian, I think, but generally the grammar structures and the syntax that the two languages use are very similar. Also, pronunciation in both languages is also very similar. So there's subtle differences between how different sounds are pronounced in Polish and in Russian. But generally, if you're learning both languages and you get the concept of the pronunciation in each language, in one of the languages, you will be able to understand how the other language's pronunciation works more easily. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I've covered the similarities and I'm going to move on to the differences, because while grammar is similar in both languages, the biggest difference is probably vocabulary. I mean, obviously, apart from the fact that each of these languages uses a different script. So Polish is written using the Latin script and Russian is written using the Cyrillic script. So obviously, if you speak Polish, you won't be able to just read Russian because we don't know how to read Cyrillic. But in terms of vocabulary, there is actually very little overlap between the languages. So many people, when they say Polish and Russian are similar, they base this opinion, maybe without knowing the languages, on the fact that they sound quite similar. Because like I said, pronunciation is quite similar. So the languages to somebody who doesn't speak either of them can sound very similar. But actually, when it comes to vocabulary, that's where the differences are. So if you think about languages like Spanish and Italian, for example, they probably share more than half of their vocabulary, and some studies show that it's as much as 80% or more than 80% of vocabulary. So when you're an Italian speaker, you can probably read Spanish quite easily. You can perhaps understand it when it's spoken as well. I can personally read Spanish no problem, even though my level in Spanish is not as good as my level in French, but because I can speak French, I know that the two languages share a lot of vocabulary. When it comes to Polish and Russian, they share less than half of their vocabulary, and I think some studies show that it's even less than 40%. If you know the exact statistic, let me know, but essentially the two languages are very distinct when it comes to their lexical makeup. So because the languages sound similar, but there isn't too much lexical overlap, there are a lot of false friends between the two languages. So if you're learning a language like Spanish and you know French, then you will know that there are some false friends. But actually you won't come across them too much. Whereas in Polish and Russian, there's quite a big number of false friends. So the example that many people often give is the verb zapomnieć in Polish, which means to forget, whereas the word, which sounds very similar, zapomnieć, means to memorize or to keep something in mind. As you can see, they sound very, very similar to each other, but they actually mean something completely opposite. So to remember and to forget are obviously opposites. Okay, another example to give you is the word owoce, which means fruit in Polish, whereas in Russian, uwości means vegetables. Excuse my pronunciation, I'm not an expert in Russian. So as you can see, the words sound very similar to each other, but they actually mean completely different things. So when you're learning Polish and Russian, you can't really rely on cognates as much as you can when you're learning languages like Italian, French or Spanish, because they share a lot more vocabulary. Okay, the next difference between Polish and Russian is that stress is very different. So in Russian, stress isn't fixed. So when you're learning a word, you need to remember which syllable stress falls on, whereas in Polish, there is a rule that the penultimate syllable is stressed. So when you're learning vocabulary, you just have to remember the word in Polish without worrying about the stress, because you just need to remember that you need to stress the second syllable from the end. Whereas in Russian, you will have to remember the stress as well as the word itself, because sometimes you can have one word which has different pronunciations with different syllables being stressed, and that changes the meaning completely. Another difference is also to do with pronunciation, and that's to do with nasal sounds such as on and el, which exist in Polish, and they're very common in Polish. They're used in many words actually, whereas in Russian they don't exist. So perhaps that makes Russian easier to learn. Okay, so that's basically it, a summary of the differences and similarities between Russian. Like I said to you before, the main similarity is in grammar, syntax, cases, things like that the two languages share. Pronunciation can be very similar as well, but the main difference between the two languages is lexical. So the vocabulary is quite different in each language, and if you think about it, a language is basically a set of words, which means if you can't understand the words, you can't understand the language, and that's probably why I can't understand Russian as a Polish speaker. But if you can, or if you're Russian and you understand Polish, let me know in the comments below. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!